The digging started in 1880 near the Sandefjord in Norway on a farm called Gokstad. The sons of the farmer knew something was under the big mound, and they called it the King's Mound. Local talk said a king was buried there with his treasure. So they started digging, they found the stern of a ship, and news reached the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Norwegian Monuments. An archaeologist named Nikolai Nikolaisen took over. He knew what this was. It was a ship burial, a big one. The work was slow, careful. They uncovered a nearly whole Viking ship preserved in the blue clay. It was built around 890 AD. Inside, they found the remains of a man, a powerful chieftain or petty king. He was buried with his belongings, horses, dogs, even a peacock. But it was the items along the ship's rail that told a different story. There were 64 shields. They were lined up, overlapping slightly along the top edge of the ship from bow to stern. Each shield was about 94 centimeters across. They were made of wooden planks, likely pine. They were not just plain wood. They had been painted, the colors were still visible, alternating yellow and black, yellow, black, yellow, black. A repeating pattern running the length of the vessel. These were not the shields of 64 different warriors, each with his own design. This was a uniform, a deliberate display. The shields were fastened to a special rail on the outside of the hull. They were there to be seen. From a distance, the ship would have looked like a serpent with bright patterned scales. It was a spectacle. It was meant to intimidate. Before a single man stepped off the boat, before a single axe was swung, the shields were already at work. They were a declaration. They announced the arrival of an organized, unified, and dangerous force. The 64 shields on the Gokstad ship were the first weapon used, and they never left the rail. Number 23, the wall was a living thing. It was the autumn of 1066. Leif stood in the line. He was young. This was his first real battle. The field was near a bridge they called Stamford. The English army was coming. He could hear them now, a low thunder of marching feet and jingling mail. He gripped his shield. It was linden wood faced with leather. The iron boss in the center felt cold and solid against his knuckles. His father, Eric, stood to his left. He was a veteran of many fights. He wasn't looking at the approaching army. He was looking at Leif. "Your shield is not a door," Eric said, his voice a low growl. "It is your brother. It protects the man to your right. His protects you." And Leif nodded, his mouth dry. He looked to his right. A man named Gunnar, with a thick red beard, gave him a grim smile. Gunnar's shield was already pressing against the edge of Leif's. The command came down the line. A guttural roar. "Skjoldborg, the shield wall!" Leif pressed forward, locking his shield with Gunnar's. Eric locked with Leif's other side. The entire front rank of their army became a single, solid wall of wood and iron. He could feel the pressure of the men behind him, their spear points bristling over the top of the shields. He was no longer Leif. He was a small part of a great beast. The English charge, the impact, was a physical shock. A wave of force crashed against the wall. Leif's arm shuddered. The shield tried to twist from his grip. He held on, leaning his whole body into it. The noise was deafening, men screaming, metal on metal. The thud of axes hitting wood. Splinters flew past his face. An English spearhead scraped across the face of his shield, leaving a deep gouge in the leather. And he felt it more than he heard it. A vibration that ran up his arm and into his teeth. He could not see the whole battle. He could only see the small section of the world in front of him. A sweating, screaming English face appeared over the top of the wall. A spear from the man behind Leif shot out, and the face disappeared. The pressure was immense. The wall groaned. It swayed back and forth, a living thing breathing under the strain. Eric yelled, "Push! Push!" with the shield. Leif pushed. The entire line surged forward a single step. An Englishman stumbled. He fell against the wall of shields. It was like falling against a meat grinder. He was gone in a second, trampled underfoot as the wall advanced. Leif used his shield not just to block, but to shove, to create space, to knock a man off balance. It was a blunt weapon. A battering ram. The wall was not static. It was an aggressive, crawling fortress, and his shield, his single round piece of wood, was one of its scales. Number 22, the tool that saved the meal. Astrid watched the embers glow in the longhouse. It was the year 1001, maybe 1002. They were far from home. A place they called Vinland. The settlement at Lanceos Meadows was small, just a few turf houses on a windswept coast. Life was hard, and every resource was precious. Her husband, Magnus, and the other men were out checking the fishing nets. It was her turn to watch the main cooking fire. A sudden gust of wind came through the smoke hole in the roof. It was a common thing, but this time it was different. A cascade of sparks blew from the central hearth. They landed on a pile of dry moss and sedge used for bedding. The material was tinder dry, it didn't smolder, it erupted, a sheet of flame shot up the wall. Panic seized her for a second. The nearest water was the stream, 100 paces away. The buckets were there. By the time she could run there and back, the whole longhouse could be engulfed. The turf walls would burn slow, but the wooden frame and the thatch roof would go up like a torch. Everything they had was in here. Tools, food, sleeping furs. She looked around, her mind racing. What was big, flat, and close? Her eyes fell on Magnus's shield. It was leaning against the wall near the door where he always left it. It was not a fancy shield, just plain wood about a meter across with a simple iron boss. No paint, no carving, a working man's shield. She did not hesitate. She grabbed the heavy shield by its central grip. It was awkward to hold, designed for a warrior's arm, not a woman's. But she managed. She ran to the fire, using the shield like a giant lid. She slammed it against the burning moss on the wall, pressing hard. The flames licked around the edges, but she smothered the heart of the blaze. The wood of the shield began to smoke. The leather rim started to char. The smell of burning hide filled the air. She held it there, putting all her weight against it. The fire beneath the shield died for lack of air. She pulled it back. A black, scorched patch remained on the turf wall. A wisp of smoke curled up. The shield was blackened. The heat had cracked the wood in one place. But the longhouse was safe. When Magnus returned, he saw the damage. He looked at the scorched shield. He looked at Astrid. He did not get angry about his damaged shield. He picked it up, tested its weight. Good, he grunted. Still strong. A shield was a tool. It was there to protect. Today, it had protected their home. That was its job. Number 21, the message board for a king. The year was 878. The marshes of the Somerset Levels were a miserable place, cold, wet. Edric was a scout for the army of Wessex. His king, Alfred, was in hiding. The great heathen army, led by Guthrum, held most of the kingdom. Edric's job was to watch them, to report their numbers and movements. It was a job that would likely get him killed. He lay on his belly in the reeds, looking at the Viking camp. It was a large encampment, bustling with activity. Men were sharpening weapons, repairing gear. He counted the fires. He estimated the number of men. It was more than they thought, far more. He also saw something else. A group of men were loading supplies onto several long, shallow boats. They were preparing to move, likely by water, to strike at Alfred's hidden fortress at Athelney. This was vital information. He had to get it back to the king. But he couldn't go himself. The camp was between him and Athelney. He had a partner, a man named Owain, who was positioned a mile to the west. They had a system, a dead drop, a place where they could leave messages for each other. But Edric had no parchment, no ink, nothing to write with. He crawled back from the edge of the reeds, his mind working. He unsheathed his seeks, a short, single-edged knife. He looked at the back of his shield. It was plain wood, unpainted. He had carried it for years. It was covered in the small nicks and scratches of a dozen skirmishes. He flipped it over, laying it flat on the damp ground. Using the tip of his knife, he began to scratch. He did not write words. Words could be understood by the enemy if the message was found. He used a simple code he and Owain had devised. A carving of a serpent meant the main army. He carved a long, winding serpent. Next to it, he scratched 10 small circles. Each circle meant 100 men. 1,000 warriors. Then he carved a boat and an arrow. The arrow pointed west. The message was clear. Main army, 1,000 strong, moving west by boat. He finished his work. The carvings were rough, but clear enough. He took his shield and crept through the swamp to the pre-arranged spot, a hollow in an ancient oak tree. He left the shield there, propped up so Owain would see it. He then took Owain's shield, which was already there, and continued his own journey. The shields were their communication system. They were heavy, awkward slates, but they were always there. They were part of their gear. In the desperate war for Wessex, a simple shield, scratched with a knife, carried a message that could save a kingdom. Number 20, a unit of exchange in the east. Sviatoslav was a trader, not a warrior, but in the land of the Rus in the year 945, a trader had to be a warrior sometimes. His journey had taken him down the great rivers, the Dnieper, to the trading posts of the Byzantine Empire. Now, he was on his way back north to his home in Kiev. His boats were loaded with silks, spices, and silver. A rich prize for any river pirate or local tribe looking for easy plunder. He had a crew of 30 men. Each was armed. But Sviatoslav knew that the best fight was the one you never had. He was approaching the lands of the Pechenegs, a nomadic people known for their fierce horsemen and their love of tribute. To fight them would be costly, even if he won. He preferred to bargain. As they neared a known Pecheneg camp, Sviatoslav ordered his men to raise their shields. Not in a defensive wall, but to display them. His crew's shields were not uniform, they were a mix of styles. Some were painted with geometric designs, some were plain, but a few, including his own, were special. They were covered in pressed leather and decorated with small bosses of bronze. They were well-made, sturdy, and came from the workshops of Kiev. The Pechenegs rode out to meet them, as expected. Their leader, a grim man with a long mustache, demanded a toll for passage. Sviatoslav did not offer silver coins, he did not offer silks. He pointed to a stack of new shields in the cargo hold. They were freshly made, linden wood, strong, with no marks of battle. The Pecheneg leader looked at the shields. He understood their value. A good shield was hard to come by on the open steppe. They did not have the timber or the craftsman. A shield was a life-saving tool in their constant tribal warfare. It was worth more to them than a handful of silver dirhams. A deal was struck. Sviatoslav's party would be allowed safe passage. In exchange, he would leave them 20 shields. The shields were a form of currency, a practical good with a recognized value. In the complex trade networks of the East, where Byzantine silver mixed with Arab coins and local barter systems, a well-made shield was a reliable unit of exchange. It was not just defensive equipment, it was a commodity. Sviatoslav watched as his men unloaded the shields. He had lost some of his goods, but he had bought peace, he had paid the toll with the very tools of war, and his journey north could continue. Number 19, the wood witnessed the word. The Althing was in session. It was the summer of 985, and the lava plains of Thingvellir in Iceland were crowded with people from every corner of the island. This was the center of their world, a place where laws were made and disputes were settled. Thorgeir was a farmer from the west. He stood before the law rock, where the law speaker recited the laws of the land. His dispute was with his neighbor, a man named Flosi, over a piece of pasture land. The arguments had gone on for 2 days. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented. Finally, the arbiters reached a decision, a compromise. The land would be divided. A new boundary would be marked by a line of stones. Both Thorgeir and Flosi had to agree to the judgment. To make it binding, they had to swear a solemn oath. There was no holy book to swear upon. The old gods did not have books. The new Christian God was still a foreign concept to most. The most sacred things they had were their word, their honor, and the objects that represented their place in society. The law speaker called for an oath ring, a silver arm ring that was kept for such occasions. He also called for a shield. One of the chieftains stepped forward and unslung his shield. It was an old one, its face painted with the image of a raven. The wood was dark and seasoned. It had seen battles, It had a history. The chieftain laid it flat on the ground between Thorgeir and Flosi. And the law speaker placed the silver oath ring on the center of the shield's boss. Place your hands upon the ring, the law speaker commanded. And Thorgeir and Flosi both knelt. They reached out and placed their hands on the cold silver, which rested on the cold iron of the shield boss. The shield was the foundation for the oath. It was the witness. It was a piece of a man's identity, a tool of his survival, and it lent its gravity to the moment. The law speaker recited the words of the oath. Thorgeir repeated them. He swore to uphold the judgment, to honor the new boundary, and to keep the peace with Flosi. He swore it by the gods, by his own honor, and over the shield. To break an oath sworn in this way was the worst crime imaginable. It would make him an outlaw, a man without honor, who could be killed by anyone without penalty. The shield on the ground was not a weapon. It was a legal document. It was a silent wooden witness to a promise that would define the rest of his life. Number 18, a canvas for the skald. And Ulf was a carver. He was not a great warrior. His hands were skilled with a knife, not an axe. He lived in the trading town of Birka on the island of Bjorko in Sweden around the year 850, where warriors and traders came and went, bringing stories from England, from Russia, from Constantinople. The Ulf listened to the skalds, the poets, who sang the tales of heroes and gods in the feasting halls. A young warrior named Hastein came to him, where Hastein was about to go on his first major voyage. He was proud, he was nervous, he had a new shield made of fresh, pale linden wood. And, it was strong and functional, but it was blank. I want my shield to tell a story, Hastein said, even before I have a story of my own. And Ulf took the shield to his workshop. He ran his hand over the smooth wood. He knew the great stories. The story of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, the tale of Ragnar's final battle in the snake pit, the binding of the great wolf Fenrir. These were the stories that every Norseman knew. They were the glue that held their culture together. He decided on the story of Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent. It was a tale of courage, of challenging a creature so vast it encircled the world. It was a fitting story for a young man setting out on a great journey. For days Ulf worked. He did not paint. He carved. With his fine bladed knives, he carefully cut into the wood of the shield. He carved the image of the god Thor in his boat, his great hammer Mjolnir raised high. He carved the head of the ox that Thor used for bait, and he carved the monstrous head of Jormungandr, the serpent, rising from the waves, its fangs bared. The detail was incredible. The scales on the serpent, the muscles in Thor's arm, the grain of the wood in the boat. When he was finished, he rubbed a dark stain made from soot and oil into the carvings. It made the images stand out against the pale wood. The shield was no longer just a piece of defensive gear. It was a work of art. It was a piece of mythology come to life. When Hashting came to collect it, he was speechless. He held the shield up. He would carry the story with him across the sea. In the chaos of a shield wall, his shield would be unique. It would tell everyone who saw it something about him. That he valued the old tales, that he saw himself in the image of a god battling a monster. The shield was his personal banner. It was a story he carried into battle, a story carved in wood. Number 17, the weight of a man's worth. The Ketil was a chieftain in Rogaland, Norway, in the late 9th century. His power was not just in the number of warriors he could command, but in the wealth he could display. Or wealth meant he could reward his followers. It meant he was a man of substance, a man to be respected. His longhouse was large, his drinking horns were tipped with silver, his wife wore fine jewelry from the east, and his weapons showed his status. He owned several swords, their hilts inlaid with silver wire. His helmet was decorated with bronze plates. But it was his shield that he often displayed most prominently. It hung on the wall above his high seat in the longhouse. It was not his fighting shield. That one was battered and plain. This was his show shield. It was made from 7 planks of yew, a much more expensive and rare wood than the common linden or pine. The face of it was not covered in simple leather. It was covered in finely tanned calfskin dyed a deep crimson. The rim was not just stitched rawhide, it was encased in a band of bronze, polished to a high shine. In the center was the boss, the iron dome that protected the hand, but this boss was not plain iron. It was larger than normal, and its surface was decorated with intricate patterns of inlaid silver. This shield was heavy. It was impractical for a long battle, but that was not its purpose. Its purpose was to be seen. When Catil held a feast, the light from the fire pits would glint off the polished bronze and silver. It spoke of his wealth without him having to say a word. It told his guests and his rivals that he could afford the best materials, the most skilled craftsmen. When a young warrior pledged his loyalty to Catil, the chieftain would sometimes reward him with a new shield. A plain, serviceable shield for a new recruit, a shield with a painted rim for a proven fighter, a shield with a bronze rim for a trusted lieutenant. The quality of the shield was a direct reflection of the man standing within Ketil's hall. A shield was not just a shield. It was a rung on the social ladder. The materials it was made from, the time and cost of its decoration, all added up to a clear statement of a man's worth. Catil's silver inlaid shield said one thing very clearly: he was the man in charge. Number 16, a companion for the final journey. The old man died in his bed. His name was Bjarni, and he had lived a long life on the island of Gotland in the year 800. He had been a raider in his youth, a farmer in his middle years, and a grandfather in his old age. His family gathered to prepare him for his final journey to the afterlife. They washed his body and dressed him in his finest clothes. They prepared a grave for him, lined with stones, and they chose the items that would accompany him: his favorite axe, its edge worn smooth from years of use, a small wooden box containing the silver coins he had saved over his lifetime, a clay pot filled with mead for the road ahead, and his shield. You know, it was an old shield, as old as he was. He had carried it since he was a boy. It was a patchwork of repairs. The linden wood was scarred with the marks of swords and axes. A long split in the planks had been carefully stitched together with sinew. The leather facing was torn in several places, and the rawhide rim was frayed. The iron boss was dented and rusted. It was not a beautiful object. It was a survivor. Each scar on the shield told a story. A deep gouge from a Frankish sword on the coast of Frisia. A series of small nicks from an English shield wall. A dark stain that he said was from a bear he fought in the woods as a young man. The shield was his history. It was a physical record of his life struggles. His eldest son, Harold, wanted to bury him with a new shield, a fine one from the family's stores. He should have a shield worthy of a chieftain for his journey, Harold argued, but Bjarni's wife stopped him. No, she said, her voice firm. He must take his own shield, the one that knows him, the one that protected him. How will his ancestors recognize him without it? She was right. In their beliefs, a man needed his tools in the next life. He would face challenges there, just as he had in this one. He needed the things that were truly his, so they placed the old, battered shield in the grave with him. They laid it over his body, covering his chest. The familiar weight of it was his final blanket. The shield was not just a grave good, an offering to the gods. It was an essential piece of Bjarni himself. It was his guardian, his companion, his storybook, and he could not make the final journey without it. Number 15, the first lesson in the yard. The boy's name was Finn, and he was 10 years old. He lived in a small settlement near the Trelleborg fortress in Denmark around the year 980. His father, Stein, was a warrior in the service of the local king. From the time he could walk, Finn had watched the men train in the yard. He saw the clashing of axes, the drilling of the shield wall. He longed for the day he would be old enough to join them. That day came on his 10th birthday. His father did not give him a toy. He gave him a shield. It was not a full-sized shield. It was smaller, lighter, made for a boy's arm, but it was a real shield, made of pine planks with a real iron boss and a leather-wrapped grip. It was the most serious gift he had ever received. "This is your first teacher," Stein told him, his face stern. "Before you learn the axe, before you learn the spear, you learn the shield. The shield keeps you alive. The axe just kills the other man." Finn's training began that day. It was not exciting. There was no mock combat. Stein made him stand in the yard for an hour just holding the shield. He had to keep it up at the ready position. His arm began to ache. The shield felt heavier and heavier. "If your arm gets tired, you die," Stein said simply. The next day, the lesson was footwork. Finn had to move forward, backward, side to side, always keeping the shield in front of him, always staying balanced. He stumbled, he tripped, he felt clumsy. His father offered no praise. He just corrected his mistakes. "A dead man is not balanced," he would say. Then came the impacts. Stein used a heavy wooden staff. He would strike Finn's shield. Not hard enough to hurt him, but hard enough to jolt him. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Finn learned to absorb the blows, to use his whole body, not just his arm. He learned to angle the shield so the blows would glance off. He learned how the shield could be used to unbalance his father, to push him back. For a year, Finn trained only with the shield. It became an extension of his arm. He learned its weight, its balance, its strengths, and its weaknesses. It taught him about distance, about timing, about defense. It was a hard, boring, and often painful education. But he knew his father was right. The shield was not just a piece of wood, it was the foundation of everything. It was the first and most important lesson a boy had to learn before he could ever hope to become a warrior. Number 14, the gleam of wood on water. Ivar was the captain of the Sea Wolf. It was the year 910, and his longship was part of a fleet sailing up the River Seine towards Paris. The Frankish lands were rich, but they were also well defended. Communication between the ships and the fleet was crucial. They had no flags like the Southerners did. They had no trumpets. They relied on simple, direct methods. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. Ivar's ship was in the lead, acting as the scout. Ahead, the river curved sharply. Ivar needed to know what was around that bend. A Frankish ambush? A fortified bridge? He sent a small, light boat ahead with two of his best men. They returned 20 minutes later, rowing hard. As they came back into view, one of the men, Rolf, stood up in the boat. He was holding his shield. He held it high above his head for all the ships behind to see. Then he began to signal. He tilted the shield to the left, then to the right, then back to the left. A simple, slow, rocking motion. This was the signal for "all clear, proceed with caution." The polished wood and the central iron boss caught the evening sun, making the signal visible from a long way down the river. Every captain in the fleet saw it and understood. Had there been an immediate danger, like an enemy force on the bank, Rolf would have held the shield flat and pumped it up and down. That meant danger, prepare for battle. If he had discovered a blockage, like a chain across the river, he would have held the shield straight out and made a sweeping horizontal motion. That meant halt, obstacle ahead. These were not complex signals. They were a basic language of movement. But they were effective. The shield was a perfect tool for the job. It was large enough to be seen from a distance. It was something every man had. It was simple to use. It was a piece of battlefield equipment repurposed for naval communication. Ivar gave the order to his own men. They rowed forward, their own shields now unslung from the rail, ready for a fight if needed. The signal had been received. The fleet moved on, a little more prepared for what lay ahead, all thanks to the simple gleam of wood on water. Number 13, the burdens it could carry. The raid on the monastery had been successful, but it had not been without cost. As Gunnar's men retreated to their longship on the beach, they carried their loot. Sacks of silver, religious icons, fine textiles. But they also carried their wounded. One of the youngest, a boy named Kael, had taken a bad wound to his leg from an axe. He could not walk. The ship was still half a mile away, across soft sand and rocky ground. Two men tried to carry him, but it was awkward and slow. They were losing time. The local feared. The militia was gathering on the hills above. Gunnar was a practical man. He wasted no time. "Olaf, Eric, your shields," he barked. The two large warriors immediately understood. They laid their shields on the ground, side by side, overlapping slightly in the middle. They were both standard round shields, about 3 feet across. And together, they formed a crude but effective platform. They carefully lifted Kale onto the makeshift stretcher. The round shape was not ideal, but it worked. His body lay across the two shields. Olaf took the grip of one shield, Eric took the other. Two other men took the outside edges of the shields. They lifted. The shields creaked under the weight, but they held. The journey to the ship was much faster now. The men could move at a quick trot, the shield stretcher held between them. It was not comfortable for Kale. The hardwood and the iron bosses dug into his back, but he was off the ground. He was moving, he was being saved. This was not the first time Gunnar had seen a shield used this way. He had seen them used to haul supplies from a ship to a camp. He had seen them used to carry a dead warrior from the battlefield with honor. He had even seen one used as a temporary sledge to drag goods over snow. The shield was a large, strong, relatively flat piece of wood with a convenient handle. Its usefulness was limited only by a man's imagination. As they reached the surf and waded out to the longship, Gunnar looked back at the burning monastery. A shield was for stopping a blow, but sometimes its most important job came after the fighting was done. It was for carrying your own, for bringing your people home. Number 12, a roof against the northern rains. They were caught in the open. A party of 5 men, led by a hunter named Rorik, tracking elk through the dense forests of western Norway. It was, late autumn in the year 962. The sky had been clear that morning, but the weather in the mountains could change in an instant. A cold, driving rain began to fall. It was not a summer shower, it was a bone-chilling deluge that soaked through their woolen cloaks in minutes. They were miles from any shelter. The temperature was dropping. To be soaked and exposed in this weather could be a death sentence. Hypothermia was a real and present danger. They needed to get a fire started, but the rain was making that impossible. Everything was wet. "Here," Rorik said, his voice sharp. He found a small clearing, slightly protected by a rock outcropping. "Make a roof." He unslung the shield from his back. The other 4 men did the same. They were not warriors' shields, decorated for battle. These were hunters' shields, plain and practical, meant to fend off a cornered boar or a wolf. They worked quickly. 2 men stood with their backs to the rock. They held their shields above their heads, angling them outwards. Rorik and another man stood opposite them, holding their shields to meet in the middle. They created a small, round roof of overlapping wood. The 5th man, the youngest, crawled into the small, dry space they had created. The rain hammered down on the shields, drummed a constant, loud rhythm on the wood and leather. Water streamed down the curved surfaces and onto the ground, but the space underneath remained dry. The young man got to work. He had a small pouch of dried fungus and his flint and steel. He scraped away the wet leaves and pine needles to find the drier earth beneath. Protected by the shield roof, he was able to strike a spark. It caught in the dry fungus. He carefully nurtured it, adding tiny dry twigs he had kept in another pouch. A small, fragile flame appeared. He slowly fed it, building it into a small, stable fire. Once the fire was going, they could collect larger, wetter pieces of wood and dry them by the flames. The men took turns holding the shields, their arms growing tired from the weight, but they had created a small island of dryness and warmth in the middle of a storm. The shield, designed to stop a sword, had stopped the rain. It had provided the shelter they needed to survive. It was a simple, improvised use for a simple tool, but in the cold forests of Norway, it was the difference between life and death. Number 11. The Table Between Two Foes. The dispute had been simmering for a generation. It was a feud between 2 families, the clan of Einar and the clan of Svein. It had started over a stolen horse and had escalated over the years into raids and killings. It was poisoning the whole fjord. Finally, the elders decided enough was enough. A meeting was arranged, not at the local thing where it would be a public spectacle. A private meeting on neutral ground. The chosen place was a small, uninhabited island in the middle of the fjord. Einar arrived with his 3 sons. Svein arrived with his 3 sons. Both parties were armed. They beached their boats on opposite sides of the island and walked towards the center. The tension was thick. A wrong word, a sudden move, could erupt into a final, bloody confrontation. They stopped 10 paces apart. There was no mediator, there was no chieftain to oversee the negotiation. It was just them. Einar's eldest son, Leif, stepped forward. He did not draw his sword. He unslung his shield. It was a large, heavy shield, its face painted with a simple red cross. He walked to the halfway point between the 2 groups. He knelt and laid the shield flat on the ground. The Iron Boss faced the sky. He then stepped back to stand with his father. It was a gesture, a clear statement. This ground is for talking, not for fighting. The shield on the ground was the negotiating table. Svein's eldest son, Magnus, saw the gesture and understood. He walked forward, took off his own sword belt, and laid his sheathed sword on the shield. Leif responded in kind, placing his own sword next to it. One by one, each man from both sides came forward and placed his weapon on the shield. The shield was now piled with axes and swords. It had disarmed them. It had created a space for peace. The negotiations began. They spoke of the original grievance. They spoke of the men who had died. They argued. They shouted. But they did not fight. The weapons were out of reach, piled on that neutral ground defined by a single piece of wood. Hours later, an agreement was reached. A blood price, a wergild, would be paid for the men who were killed. A marriage would be arranged between Svein's daughter and Einar's youngest son to seal the peace. The feud was over. One by one, the men walked forward and retrieved their weapons from the shield. The last to be picked up was Leif's. He slung it back over his shoulder. The shield had not blocked a single blow that day, but it had stopped a war. Number 10, the sound that shook the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. A small raiding party of about 40 men, led by a veteran warrior named Rolf the Grim, was moving through the dense woods of Northumbria. It was the year 867. They were deep in enemy territory, looking for an unfortified monastery rumored to be rich with silver. They were moving in a loose formation, their shields on their backs, their axes in their hands. Suddenly, a horn blast echoed through the trees to their left. Well, it was an English horn, an ambush. Before Rolf could shout an order, a shower of arrows rained down from the ridge above. 2 of his men fell, clutching at shafts buried in their chests. Then the sound began. From the woods all around them, a deep, rhythmic booming sound started. Boom, 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 boom. It was not a drum, it was a sound Rolf knew well. It was the sound of weapons hitting shields. The local English Fyrd was not just attacking them, they were trying to terrify them. They were hidden in the trees, beating the flats of their swords and the heads of their axes against their own shields. The sound was unnerving. It echoed through the forest, seeming to come from every direction at once. It made their numbers seem vast. It was a psychological attack meant to sow panic and confusion before the main assault even began. Rolf's men, mostly young and inexperienced, began to look around nervously, their eyes wide. They were surrounded by a sound, an invisible, threatening presence. Shields. Rolf roared, his voice cutting through the noise. Wall! To me! His men scrambled to obey, pulling their shields from their backs and forming a small, tight circle around him. They raised their shields, preparing for the charge they knew was coming. Rolf knew what he had to do. He had to answer their noise with his own. Beat them, he yelled. He began to hammer the butt of his spear against the inside of his own shield. Thump, thump, thump. His men followed his lead. A new rhythm joined the chaos of the forest, their own defiant drumming. It was a way of steadying their nerves, a way of communicating their defiance, a way of saying, we are here, we are not broken, we are ready. The 2 sounds battled in the forest, the English booming, the Norse thumping. It was a conversation held in percussion. For a few moments, the forest was filled with nothing but the sound of men, beating their shields, a prelude to the violence that was about to be unleashed. The shield was not just protection, it was an instrument, a war drum, a tool to control the minds of both friend and foe. Number 9, a raft of last resort. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment, the sea was choppy but manageable. The next, a furious gale was upon them. Eric's trading nar, a sturdy merchant ship, was caught off the coast of Jutland in the spring of 1015. The waves were monstrous, washing over the deck. The single square sail had been torn to shreds. The steering oar snapped with a crack like thunder. The ship was helpless, at the mercy of the sea. It did not take long. A massive wave crashed down on them, and the ship's timbers groaned and then broke. The nar splintered apart, throwing the 10 men of its crew into the freezing, churning water. Eric came to the surface, gasping, salt water stinging his eyes. The wreck of his ship was already disappearing beneath the waves. His cargo of wool and amber was gone. All that mattered now was survival. He saw 2 of his crewmen clinging to a large wooden spar. But there was not room for everyone. He looked around desperately and saw something floating nearby. It was one of the shields that had been stowed on deck. Unlike a warrior's longship, a nar did not display its shields on the rail, but they were kept for protection against pirates. This one was a standard pine shield faced with thick leather. Wood and leather, it floated. Eric swam towards it, his waterlogged woolen clothes weighing him down. And he reached it and grabbed the leather straps on the back. It was not a raft. It could not support his full weight. But it was buoyant. He could rest his upper body on it, keeping his head and shoulders out of the water. It gave him a precious reprieve from the constant struggle to stay afloat. Another of his crewmen, a young man named Lars, swam towards him. Eric helped him grab onto the other side of the shield. The 2 men clung to the single round shield, back to back, their legs kicking slowly to keep them oriented against the waves. The shield was a tiny island in a world of watery chaos. It was not much, but it was something. For hours they drifted, battered by the waves, their bodies growing numb from the cold. The shield was their only hope. It was a piece of equipment designed for one kind of battle, now being used in a completely different one. It was a battle against the sea itself. As the first light of dawn broke, they saw land, a low, sandy coastline. Kicking with their last reserves of strength, they used the shield to help them paddle towards it. They collapsed on the beach, exhausted, cold, but alive. They had lost their ship, their cargo, and most of their crew, but 2 of them had survived thanks to a simple wooden shield that became a raft of last resort. Number 8, the board for a king's game. The winter of 998 was long and cold in Dublin. The Norse settlement there was a thriving, busy port for most of the year, but in the depths of winter there was little to do. The ships were pulled ashore, the raids stopped, the days were short and the nights were long. It was a time for mending gear, for telling stories, and for games. In the smoky hall of Sigtryg Silkbeard, the Norse king of Dublin, a game was in progress. It was Nefatafel, the king's table. It was a game of strategy, a game of war. One player had a king and a small force of defenders starting in the center of the board. The other player had a larger force of attackers starting on the edges. The goal of the king was to escape to one of the corners. The goal of the attackers was to capture him. The board they were playing on was not a finely carved piece of walnut. It was a shield. An old war shield, its face scarred and battered, had been repurposed. A grid of squares had been burned into the leather facing with a hot iron. It was a large round board laid flat on a low table between the king and his challenger, an Irish chieftain named Murchad. The playing pieces were made of carved bone, dark pieces for the attackers, light pieces for the defenders. The king was a larger, more ornate piece. Sigtryg, a cunning player, moved one of his defenders, blocking Murchad's path to the king. Well, he was surrounded, but there was still a way out. The game mirrored the political realities outside the hall. Sigtryg was a Norse king in a mostly Irish land, always surrounded, always looking for an escape route, a path to victory. Using a shield as a game board was common. It was the right size. It was portable. It was something every man owned. In camps, on campaign, on the decks of longships during a calm, or in the longhouse during winter, the shield could be transformed from a tool of war to a tool of leisure. The very object used to defend a man's life in the chaos of battle could also be used to challenge his mind in a game of pure logic. Murchad studied the board. He moved one of his attacking pieces, closing the trap a little further. The game was quiet, intense. The only sounds were the click of the bone pieces on the hard leather of the shield and the crackle of the fire. For these two men, for this moment, the shield was not a weapon. It was a battlefield of the mind. Number 7, a wall against the beasts. The farm was isolated. It lay in a small cleared valley deep in the highlands of Norway. The year was 820. For Halvar and his family, the greatest threat was not other men. It was the wilderness. Wolves were a constant problem, especially in the winter when food was scarce. A pack had been harassing his small flock of sheep for weeks. One evening, just as dusk was settling, the attack came. Not on the sheep in their stone pen, but on the longhouse itself. A large wolf, bolder and more desperate than the rest, had managed to get into the small storehouse attached to the main building. And Halvar's wife, Ingrid, had gone to fetch some dried fish and had come face to face with the snarling animal. Her screams brought Halvar running. He grabbed the first weapon he could find, a wood-cutting axe. The wolf was cornered. It was a big male, its fur bristling, its teeth bared. It was trapped and dangerous. Halvar knew a direct attack was risky. The wolf was faster than him, and its bite could cripple an arm. Ingrid, the shields, he yelled. His wife, who had scrambled back into the main room, understood immediately. Leaning against the wall were 2 old shields. They were no longer used for fighting. They were family heirlooms, belonging to her father and grandfather. She dragged them over to the doorway of the storehouse. Halvar took one. He did not hold it like a warrior. He held it low, like a wall. He advanced slowly into the storehouse, the large wooden circle forming a barrier between him and the wolf. The wolf lunged, not at Halvar, but at the shield. Its jaws snapped shut on the rawhide rim. Its claws scrabbled against the wooden face. The shield held. It absorbed the attack, keeping the wolf's teeth away from Halvar's body. While the wolf was occupied with the first shield, Ingrid, showing immense courage, used the second shield. She did not try to fight. She used it to close the distance, to push. She and Halvar used the 2 shields to herd the animal, creating a moving wall, forcing it back towards the outer door of the storehouse, which she had unlatched. The wolf, finding its attacks useless against the hard, unyielding wood, and feeling the pressure of the advancing wall, saw the opening. It released its grip, darted past them, and fled out into the night. Halvar stood breathing heavily, the axe still in his hand. The shield had deep teeth marks in its rim, but it had done its job. In a place where the lines between man and nature were thin, the shield was not just for fighting other men. It was a tool of defense against a wild and often hostile world. Number 6, a lever to break a door. The siege of Paris in 885 had dragged on for months. The Vikings had surrounded the city, but its walls were strong. The Franks were well defended. Small skirmishes happened daily. Raiding parties would try to find a weak spot, a gate left unguarded, a section of wall that could be scaled. Bjorn Ironside, a seasoned warrior, was leading one such party. They were not trying to breach the main walls. Their target was a fortified monastery just outside the city proper. They had managed to cross the moat under the cover of darkness, and were now at a small, heavy oak door that led into the monastery's cellar. It was barred from the inside. They had no battering ram. They had to work quietly. One of the men tried to hack at the door with his axe, but the wood was too thick. The noise was attracting attention. They could hear shouting from the walls above. Time was running out. Bjorn looked at the door. He saw the small gap between the bottom of the door and the stone threshold. He had an idea. "Give me your shield," he said to a large man named Kunt, "and your axe." Kunt handed them over. Bjorn took the heavy shield and tried to force the edge of it into the gap under the door. It was a tight fit, but with a few hard kicks, he managed to wedge it in. Now he had a lever, he took the axe, flipped it around, and shoved the heavy flat pole of the axe head under the shield. The shield acted as a broad, flat surface to distribute the force and prevent the axe from just splintering the wood. With the axe handle sticking out, he had a long lever. "On my mark," he grunted to three of his biggest men. "Push down all your weight." He positioned them on the axe handle. Now, the three men threw their entire weight onto the handle. The wood creaked, the shield groaned under the immense pressure. There was a loud crack. It was not the shield that broke. It was the iron bar on the inside of the door, torn from its wooden brackets by the force. The door swung inwards. They were in. The whole operation had taken less than a minute. It was a clever piece of improvisation. The shield, a defensive tool, had been used as a fulcrum. It had become a siege engine in miniature. It was a testament to the raiders' ability to use the tools they had on hand in creative and unexpected ways. For them, a shield was not just one thing. It was whatever they needed it to be at that moment. Number 5. The King's Shadow. To be a king's man, a member of his personal bodyguard or herd, was a position of great honor. It came with rewards, arm rings, land, a place in the king's hall. But it came with one overriding duty: to protect the king's life, even at the cost of your own. In the chaos of 10th century Scandinavian politics, this was a duty that was tested often. Olaf was one of the herdmen of King Haakon the Good of Norway. In the year 961, at the Battle of Fitjar, King Haakon was fighting in the front ranks, as was the custom for a warrior king. He was a conspicuous figure, his helmet gleaming, his banner flying nearby. He was a target. The battle was a swirling mess of individual combats. A large enemy warrior, a Jarl from a rival clan, broke through the line and charged directly at the king. He swung a massive two-handed axe, a weapon designed to crush shields and shatter bone. King Haakon was engaged with another opponent and did not see the new threat coming. Though Olaf saw it. He was several feet away, fighting his own battle. He had no time to intercept the attacker, no time to bring his own weapon to bear. He did the only thing he could. He threw himself in front of his king. He did not try to block the blow with his own shield in a conventional way. He turned his body and covered the king, holding his shield flat against the king's side. The great axe came down. It did not hit the king. It hit Olaf's shield. The force of the blow was tremendous. The axe bit deep into the wood, splitting it from rim to boss. The shield shattered, the wood giving way under the immense impact. The force of the blow still threw Olaf to the ground, his arm broken, his ribs cracked. But the shield had absorbed the lethal energy of the strike. It had sacrificed itself. King Haakon's other herdmen dispatched the attacker immediately. The king was safe. He looked down at Olaf, who was lying amidst the splinters of his own shield. He saw the broken arm, the grimace of pain. He also saw the unwavering loyalty. To be under a king's shield was a common phrase. It meant to be under his protection. But for the king's herd, the meaning was reversed. The king was under their shield. Their bodies and their shields were his final line of defense. Olaf had fulfilled his oath. His broken shield was the proof. Number 4, a raft across the mud. The Lindisfarne Monastery stood on what was known as Holy Island. It was connected to the coast of Northumbria by a tidal causeway. At high tide, it was an island. At low tide, a muddy, treacherous path was revealed. It was the year 793. Rauld and his raiding party had not timed their arrival well. They had beached their longship as the tide was going out, and now they were faced with a wide expanse of deep, thick mud between them and the stone causeway that led to the monastery. To walk through the mud would be slow and exhausting. They would be caked in it, their movements sluggish by the time they reached the monks. It would leave them vulnerable to attack. They needed a way to cross the mudflats quickly and cleanly. Rauld, the leader, looked at the mud, then at his men. An idea formed. "The shields," he ordered. "Make a path." The men looked at him. confused for a second. Then they understood. One by one, the first 10 men in the line went to the edge of the mud. They laid their shields down flat on the surface. The broad, round shape of the shields distributed their weight, preventing them from sinking immediately. They had created a short, floating wooden bridge. Roald was the first to cross. He stepped carefully from one shield to the next. As the shield squelched and sank slightly under his weight, but they held. He reached the end of the 10 shields, and the man behind him handed him his own shield, which he laid down at the end of the line to extend the path. They developed a rhythm. The man at the back of the line would pick up the shield he had just crossed, pass it to the front of the line, and the path would be extended. It was a slow, laborious process, a crawling bridge of shields, but it worked. They were moving across the mud, not through it. Their feet remained clean, their legs free. The monks watching from the monastery walls saw a strange sight. A serpent of wood and iron slithering across the mud towards them. It was an unnerving, relentless advance. The raiders were using their most basic piece of equipment, not for defense, but for logistics, for engineering. They were solving a problem of terrain with the tools they carried on their backs. The shield was not just for the battlefield. It was a tool for getting to the battlefield. Number 3, a mark of a free man. It was a cold morning at the slave market in Hedeby. The year was around 950. Hedeby was one of the great trading centers of the age, a bustling, chaotic town where goods and people from all over the known world were bought and sold. Asbjorn stood on a low wooden platform. He was a captive taken in a raid on an Irish village a year ago. He had been a farmer. Now he was property. He owned nothing, not his clothes, not his own body. He stood there waiting to be sold. A man named Thorolf bought him. Thorolf was a landowner from the north of Denmark. He needed strong backs to work his fields. Asbjorn's life for the next 5 years was one of hard labor. He rose before the sun and worked until after it set. He slept in a barn with the other thralls. He was fed, he was clothed, but he was not free. Asbjorn was a good worker. He was strong and he did not cause trouble. Thorolf noticed this. After 5 years, on a midsummer's festival, Thorolf called Asbjorn to the front of the feasting hall. He declared that Asbjorn had served him well. He was granting him his freedom. He was no longer a thrall. He was a freeman. But freedom was more than just a word. It came with responsibilities and symbols. A thrall was not allowed to own weapons. A free man was expected to. He was expected to be able to defend his home, to answer the call to arms from his chieftain. Thorolf presented Asbjorn with 2 things. The first was a spear. The second was a shield. The shield was plain, unpainted pine wood, a simple iron boss. But to Asbjorn, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He took it, he felt the weight of it in his hand, the roughness of the wood. For 5 years he had been forbidden from even touching such a thing. Now he owned one. The shield was a clear, undeniable symbol of his new status. When he walked through the village now, carrying his shield, everyone knew what he was. He was not a slave. He was not property. He was a man who was responsible for his own defense. A man who had a stake in the community. The shield was more than a piece of wood. It was his certificate of freedom. It was a mark of his transformation from an object to a person. Number 2, the cradle and the coffin lid. Life on a small farmstead in 10th century Iceland was a cycle of birth and death. Gudrun was a woman who knew this cycle well. She had given birth to 6 children. She had buried 3 of them. The land was harsh, the winters long. Life was fragile. When her 4th child, a son named Brand, was born, he was small and weak. In the first few weeks of his life, he was constantly cold. The longhouse was drafty. Keeping the infant warm was a constant struggle. Gudrun found an ingenious solution. Her husband, Ulfar, had an old shield stored in the rafters. Its fighting days were long over. The wood was split, the leather facing mostly gone. Gudrun took the old shield down. She cleaned it thoroughly. She lined the inside of it with their softest sheepskins. The shield's concave shape and its round walls made a perfect small cradle. It was portable. She could carry it with her as she worked around the longhouse, always keeping the baby close to the warmth of the central fire. The thick wood of the shield insulated him from the cold drafts along the floor. The old shield, which had once protected a warrior from cold steel, was now protecting an infant from the cold air. And Brand grew strong in his shield cradle. Years passed. Brand grew into a man. He took his own shield and went on voyages, returning with silver and stories. Gudrun and Ulfar grew old. One winter, Ulfar fell ill. A lung sickness took him quickly. It was Gudrun's sad duty to prepare his body for burial. They did not have the wood to spare for a proper coffin. Timber was scarce in Iceland. Burials were often simpler. They wrapped Ulfar's body in a woolen shroud. As a final act of love and respect, Gudrun went to the stores and retrieved Brand's first full-sized shield, the one he had carried as a young man before he got his newer, stronger one. She laid the shield over her husband's chest and face. It was not part of a warrior's burial rite. It was a practical act. It was a lid, a final cover to protect him on his journey. The same object, a round piece of wood and iron, had served her family in two profound ways. It had been the cradle that protected the beginning of a life. And now, it was the cover that marked the end of one. It was a silent witness to the entire span of a human life. Number 1, the first and final gift. Harald was old. He knew this was his last winter. He sat by the fire, his hands gnarled by age and a life of hard work. His great-grandson, a boy of 7 named Magnus, sat at his feet listening to the old man's stories. Harald had been a boat builder in his youth in the great shipyards of Roskilde around the year 1020. He had helped build the great longships for the kings. He had never been a great warrior, but like all free men, he had owned a shield. It had hung on the wall of his house for 60 years. It was a simple thing, made of fir planks with a heavy iron boss he had forged himself. He had carried it when he served his mandatory time in the local levy. It had never seen a real battle, but it had been a constant presence in his life. A symbol of his duties and his rights. "Go and fetch it," Harold rasped, pointing a shaky finger towards the shield on the wall. Magnus, his eyes wide, scrambled to do as he was told. The shield was almost as tall as he was. He dragged it across the floor and laid it at the old man's feet. Harald ran his hand over the wood. "A man's life is marked by 2 shields," he said, his voice quiet. "The first is the one his father gives him when he is a boy. It teaches him how to be a man. It teaches him responsibility. It is a gift of hope, of a future." He looked at Magnus. "You will get your first shield soon. You will learn its lessons." He paused, taking a long, slow breath. "The second shield is the last one. The one they lay on top of you when you are in the ground, or the one they burn with you on the pyre." He looked down at the shield at his feet. "It is a gift of memory. It says who you were, a free man, a member of the community. It protects you on your final journey." He looked at the shield, then back at the boy. "This one," he said, tapping the wood, "this one has been with me my whole life. It was my first shield. My father made it for me. And when I die, it will be my last. It will be both for me." In that moment, the shield was not a weapon. It was not a tool. It was the container of a life. It was the first gift a boy received that set him on the path to manhood. And it was the last object that accompanied a man out of the world. It marked the beginning and the end. A circle of wood for the circle of life.